Designed by Aerosand and Associates, 1954. This is a building that gave a significant presence and posture to the major intersection of downtown Columbus at Washington and 5th Streets, a building that revolutionized the design of banks by flipping solidity for transparency. And our first presentation for the site, adjacent to the bank, is Nogues Studio, which is an integrated design and fabrication practice led by Benjamin Ball and Gaston Nogues. Based in Los Angeles, the studio operates in a territory between architecture, art, and industrial design. Their work has been exhibited at the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA, MoMA New York, the Guggenheim, PS1 in New York, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Venice Biennale, the Hong Kong Shenzhen Biennale, and the Beijing Biennale. In 2007, the studio won MoMA PS1's Young Architects Program competition. Their work is also part of the permanent collection of both MoMA and LACMA. The studio is currently working on a permanent public commission for Sound Transit Bellevue Station, Central Washington University, Fort Dodge Middle School, and Chicago Transit. We welcome Benjamin.
20 minutes. Okay. You know, that's not a, I'm gonna do is proactive here. I'm gonna set my timer so that I have some real-time feedback. It's always really great to be here. First came here about 6 years ago and was really enchanted with the place. Coming back this time, I have to say, it makes me really nervous because I have this esteemed jury and a good number of interested folks from Columbus and a lot of my colleagues. And I don't always make presentations in that context, so it's a reflection of how much this means to us and how happy we are to participate. So thanks. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of what Nogues does, because I think that it's important for understanding how we approached this particular project. And you can see there I called this Bank and Trust in Paper. You could easily have called it Union and Trust in Paper in reference to the Union Trust Company building. Nogues Studio is a integrated design and fabrication practice. And that means to us that we have a very tight integration of making and designing and thinking and conceptualizing our work. We have a 4,000 square foot studio space in downtown Los Angeles that is both a place for making and also a place for designing. And because we've been so involved with the production of all of our projects, I couldn't help but sort of impact the way that we design them. And I think we've turned production into one of the primary informers of our design process. So what we do is something we call design of the production process. And we have been working on a couple of projects in production over the years that have evolved to the point that we are ready to take them to the scale of buildings. So we'll typically start things in a kind of experimental context, tinkering, and then we will move into making objects, and then maybe somebody will commission us to do an installation, and somebody will then commission us, hopefully, to do something a little more long-lasting. This project, because it is a temporary project, so you missed the little video of our studio. I can give you the synopsis. It's a tracking cam shot that starts upstairs in the design office and goes down the stairs on this rig that we made, and it shows some guys, people welding, and a bunch of busy elves making things. And that's how the studio works. So one of the projects that we've been doing, the production processes that we've been into in the last several years, and it started with very simple interests in making paper shells for no good reason at all, and has evolved into what I'm going to present to you today. These are a set of paper lamps that were made by high school students under our tutelage for a fellowship that we did with Barnsdall Arts and the Kotzen organization in Los Angeles. And we were selected to do this fellowship. And we thought, well, what should we do? These are art students. Let's give them a taste of what it means to produce something with very tight production and fabrication parameters, but then give them the space to add their own personal affects to it. So these are lamps that were produced using a technique that we developed, which is a shell mold technique using flexible molds. And within each of the molds are personal objects that were meaningful to each of the students. So each of these has a story that comes from the individual student. But the results are controlled and they're consistent. The quality is controlled. But we gave them this sort of freedom to move around within the production technique. We started actually several years ago doing it with these Mickey Mouse balloons and stockings that produce this result. And then we wanted to go up in scale, and we started thinking about all of the installations that we do. We were doing like 2 or 3 temporary installations a year, and we started thinking about what does that mean in terms of life cycle? What does it mean? How is it different than, say, a building? These LEED standards for buildings give you, you've got to get stuff within 500 miles, and you've got to keep the amount of energy really low. But we thought, well, maybe temporary projects deserve a very different consideration when it comes to life cycle. So we started looking at materials that might be appropriate for that, and what we became more and more interested in the use of molded paper because it comes from a renewable, recycled resource and then can be returned to the earth as compost and even embedded with seeds so that it actually nourishes the ground on which it's decomposing. So what is this technique? This is how we produce the pieces with the kids. And what's unique about this is that we are making a shell without, typically a shell project would require 2 parts and there'd be a part line in it. But because these are flexible molds and they have inflatable volume within them, we're able to deflate the volume, pull them out of the molds, and we're able to get these shells very rapidly and also without part lines. And it allows for a great deal of freedom in the design process and the shaping, assuming that you have the boundary of this stocking located securely. That resulted in this project that we were quite pleased with, glob lamps at the Santa Barbara Museum of Contemporary Art. So each of these is about the size of a person, but they start to also explore referential imagery within this mold making process. So they start to suggest classical sculpture, busts, so forth. Is that the end? No. All right, so I'm saying, okay. I got 10 minutes here, but I'm going to add 3. All right. And so this gives you a sense of the materiality. So these are lit with very simple lighting fixtures on the inside, and they are self-supporting shells with no internal armature, except for the armature which holds the lighting. Moving along in our development of paper pulp as architectural material, we developed this project for the Coachella Festival last year, which was something like 17 feet high, 50 feet long, out of molded paper and jute composite, fully engineered to withstand 65-mile-an-hour gusts, and created a very different kind of look and feel, affect, than previous projects using the same material. But just briefly, it was a kind of proprietary process that we developed where we were kind of spraying these matrices with paper pulp that we created using 4 of custom-built, purpose-built blenders, 65-gallon blenders, and our own customized spray system. We've also worked in panelizing paper. This project called Negative Impression at SciArc used a Volkswagen Bug as the mold, to make architectural space. And so this became a kind of, got us to thinking about maybe we could make an architecture of kind of direct sampling or direct quotation using objects from a particular place and then recombining them. And this becomes an idea that you saw in the Kotzen pieces with the kids' personalized items, and will be also an idea that we want to pursue here. Another project we did in 2010 where we used, thinking about upcycling in a temporary context, where we upcycled custom tables, using them as a kind of chain mail and a sound reflecting device for performances that then you could take home, put in your living room. But looking here at Columbus, in Saarinen, in the Union Trust Company building, we were most struck by the elemental nature of its structure, as well as this series of this grid of 9 domes that he used, and started thinking about how we could make something meaningful out of paper, or try to create meaning with paper in reference to this particular building. And so what we've tried to do here is to create an analogous structure which uses some of the same organizing principles as Saarinen, but rendered it and created it in pulped paper that has been treated for use in this climate. One of the things that's always struck me about Saarinen is that every project was kind of an invention. He was criticized throughout his career for never having a style, and we've suffered the same criticism. But I think that we wanted to maintain the spirit of that and do a project that was also a kind of invention, something that was less about kind of form was part of it, but it was about inventing and perfecting and advancing a process that would enable us to take materials further. In the spirit that Saarinen did at TWA, at the Arch, at MIT, at Yale, and at Dulles. Every one of those projects, different structural typology, to some critics, could have been done by a different architect. So looking at how we can take this and make this analog next to it, and thinking about it as a kind of public scaled lantern, a lantern, almost a kind of, in the spirit of a lantern festival. We felt, looking at that site, the lighting is quite low to the ground at these, using these tow lights. So we thought this provided a kind of a great opportunity to make this elevated roof structure, which reflects or uses Saarinen's 9-square grid of domes, or the circle in plan, and repeats that, so that the viewer, the audience, will draw a comparison and make, maybe allow them to analyze how paper is used to produce something that achieves some of the same kind of spatial conditions that Saarinen produced. And then coming back to the idea I mentioned earlier about molding everyday objects, we studied how we would begin to take the patterns and the objects. These are actually his chairs. The objects from the building. These are the office chair and also the tulip chair are built in there. The brick pattern, the famous brick pattern, and build them into the mold so that this becomes a kind of a storytelling device, like a frieze. But it's telling the story of the production of our pavilion vis-a-vis the architectural details, furniture designs, and objects of Eero Saarinen. Friezes, stretch back several thousand years, all the way to the 20th century. We want it to make a kind of contemporary frieze. So we're sampling the lamp, I think that might be Van Nelson, the chair, the brick pattern, and we're bringing it into the building. The materials are shredded paper, taken out of the waste stream, that we then pulp and process. We spray it to give us the form, and then afterwards we shred it, and you can compost it, and we infuse it with wildflower seeds so that it nourishes the soil. Like I said, the Lantern Festival is an inspiration for this project. The temporary nature of it, this making a special place by way of light. How does it work? It's a very simple structural idea, a grid, earth anchored to the ground, earth screws. We're working on the lawn, and the structural frame holds the paper. The paper makes the small spans that it's capable of making. At the bottom, we have a hole cut so you get direct light, in reference to some of the lighting ideas that Saarinen had in his building. So you get a more ambient light here, and you get a kind of direct light. And then working with the slope of the piece to divert water, shed water quickly, which I wanted to show you. So I brought a model, which is a bucket, or a tray, and a disposable bedpan. And we're gonna do a little experiment here. You can see this has been treated with an additive, and it's also been sprayed with a post after it's been formed. It's been sprayed with an epoxy resin that beads off and sheds the water to make it water resistant. I'll just let that sit there. Have a swig. So we looked at also how this would be broken into elements that are tuned to the spans and curvatures that paper in this form wants to take. And it's a delicate balance between monolithic, sort of larger pieces and smaller, more tube-like pieces. The smaller, more tube-like pieces, as you can imagine, act like individual beams, individual fibers, I suppose, almost like the paper itself. And so we've been working on optimizing what is the amount of curvature that we could use and achieve in this, and the amount of porosity within it. Here's a little diagram of the mold making process. What I love about this, for this project, is that it does not require a tremendous amount of skill to put this together, which means it opens up the potential for very interesting collaborations with high school students or college students. You know, I showed you the pictures of the Kotzen stuff that was made by high school kids who had a young interest in art and design. There's a lot of room for flexibility in what happens in this space, as long as you get the bulkheads that hold it, that stretch, with which you stretch the fabric tight, and they're held in consistently in the same location. Again, the light concept. Here's the bulkhead. So what happens in between the bulkhead, the structure is isolated in the middle, and then we surround it with these inflatables. And the bulkhead really provides the kind of outer limits of each individual unit, but then what happens within here is a kind of improvisational process that can be, on which we can collaborate with folks who don't have super high levels of skill, but have an interest in working with us. So there is an internal structure. The project would be, the internal structure would be fabricated in Los Angeles in our studio, and we have all of the CNC equipment to do that, and then welded and shipped to Columbus, and then the spray process would happen here in a rented space here, and then we would also, before that process began, negotiate to find people that would be interested in working with us on it. And then installation, of course, is a fairly quick process because it's modular. The budget, I'll let you guys look at that on your own. Okay, and then, so there we are. I think we've got the time, that's 3 minutes. In summary, we're interested in taking a production research that we've been doing, design research, and extending it through this project. And we think this is a very fascinating opportunity to do that, and it provides a fascinating opportunity to do it in collaboration with people from here, and also to reflect upon the history of the building and the history of kind of the spirit, I think, of Saarinen's work to make a celebratory festival-type space that will be there for one brief moment and hopefully responsibly disposed of afterwards. Thanks.
Hello. Oh. Can you describe the day view versus the night view, just in your mind a bit? It's so glowing here at night, but I don't have a great sense of the day view.
Well, the day view, you'd have to look at. The day view, it's going to look more like this guy, right? There you go. So the day view, the day view is about surface. The night view is about light. It's a very flattering light too, because it's like being softboxed, like by a portrait photographer. It makes people look really beautiful, and I think that that's always a good thing.
And the sun doesn't create an additional glow? It's quite opaque.
It will, no, it's not opaque enough to, it will get some of the sun will come through it. That's the part that's difficult to test because we don't know exactly how thick it's going to be. We don't know exactly how much distance there's going to be between the top of the surfaces and the bottom of the surfaces. But if you put sunlight on this, it will glow. It won't glow like the image on the right, but it will glow. And I think what's interesting to me about this is the difference between day and night. It's not meant entirely to be a night project. It's meant to bring people there at different times of the day and experience it in different lighting conditions.
You mentioned that, I don't know what exactly the context was, that people can understand the materiality of the project. How do they understand that it's paper and fibers?
Because the name?
But where will that be on the site? I mean, when you're there, what do you expect people to, respond to in terms of materiality? What do you think they're going to be?
I think they're going to ask questions. And I think they're going to see that it is something that's in dialogue with, the Union Trust Company building. And they're going to say, well, this is a different kind of material, but I see this as being a kind of double of the bank. And it's going to make them engage with it intellectually and analytically. I don't expect it to be a didactic sort of thing for everybody. I don't pretend to know how everyone is going to respond, but I want to set up a situation which they can contemplate and that provides a lot of points of entry for people. For an engineer who works for Cummins, who understands materials, they might come there and say, wow, what is this? And I see the structural logic and how it relates to the building. For a child, they might come there and say, wow, it's a big lamp. And for a person that's been to the bank and used the bank or the conference center, they might recognize the pattern, or they've heard the story about the pattern on the floor, and they might say, wow, this is like using that pattern as a quotation and using it as a mold. So I think that there's a lot of different points of entry. I don't have a single one.
I mean, I think another reading, just as an aside, could be, it's almost like the absent orchard, the grid. I mean, there's almost like a kind of, having just seen the pergola project,
Sure.
There is a kind of pergola quality about this. But my question was going to be more about the relationship to the interior of the Saarinen building at night. And are you predicating this partially on it being illuminated?
Every time I've driven by, or walked by, it's been illuminated. But I think it's good. I think it would be great if the building was illuminated. Because, you have two different kinds of light. You have light that's reflecting and emanating from behind the glass, and it's tightly clipped by this roof plane. And then you have our thing, which is this kind of glowing glob structure, this kind of glowing cloud of Saarinen chairs. So I think that it would be good if the building were illuminated. Yes. And that's where I got the idea. Was last time I was here, I walked by it at night. I hadn't seen it at night, and I was like, wow, that's really dramatic. And the lights in the other Cummins building were not on, although they could be.
I have a scale question.
Yeah.
So is there a scalar relationship with the original quote-unquote building, with the Saarinen building? Or is this an approximation filling in the space of the site?
It's meant to be have a proportional relationship to the Saarinen building. So clear, that's pretty obvious by that drawing. It's meant to fill the site and to, on one end, so that it also creates a kind of a big lawn in front of it. So there's different viewing conditions depending upon where one sees it. So here you kind of see, you'll be able to see under it along this street. And here you kind of get a real understanding of how it might relate to the Union Trust building. But the scale of it is more based upon what paper can do in terms of spans. So it is a paper model using paper's rules to emulate the spatial conditions, or to kind of double the spatial conditions of Saarinen, to make this sort of double, or this kind of analog.
So the lantern quality, are you internally illuminating here, or is this just projecting down? I wasn't entirely clear from the render.
T12 fluorescents,
Okay.
and you can gel them so that warms the light up. Meant to be, I mean, there's $70,000 budget, so they've got to be reliable. You don't want to change them over the course of the project, and they've got to throw a lot of light. So yeah,
And this
there'll
is
be a lot of them.
This is the one installation you can see from above, right? So this is sitting next to the Roche 3-story building.
You'd be able to see it from, oh, without doubt.
Okay. Then what is the life cycle of the product?
At least 3 months. I mean, that's the thing, you know, like, that's the thing that's so interesting to us about temporary projects, is that you see temporary projects built out of steel, you see them built out of concrete, and those are material, and that's what going back to what I was saying about addressing the topic of life cycle on the terms provided by ephemeral architecture. Why should an ephemeral, I think it's so much more interesting to design something specifically to a purpose. So the paper, yeah, it might last 6 months, it might last a year, it might last 4 months, but we're just aiming to get it beyond that. We're aiming to get it beyond that threshold. You know, probably our first project, our most successful project, was generated more press than we've ever had. I'm still kind of convinced that it was successful because we only designed it to live for 6 months, and consequently we didn't have this massive investment in things, in materials and processes that were, you know, suited to, say, the conventional building industry. I think that temporary architecture, it's interesting to think about it more almost like product design. It's a disposable product, like these. And I think that it's worth showcasing that concept as part of the project, and actually making that part of the content of the project, so that people understand that we live in a world that's where design is tailored to, you know, particulars of life cycle, or it should be. You don't design a 100-year thing that's going to be there for 5 months.
Have you done additional durability testing or application of other materials, like if all the leaves fall, or dog urine, or I don't know, any other scenarios that might arise?
I mean, the scenarios that arise are, you know, like wind and water, right?
Yeah.
So we want to elevate, this one might be a little bit out of scale, but we want to elevate this at least 7 or 8 feet off the ground, so it's out of reach. No dog, I'm sorry, I don't know what kind of dog you have.
Sorry, I didn't realize the columns were not out of this.
No, the columns are steel. You know, we're not building this entire thing. It's not. I wish. But you know, I think that we're, you know, this is one project in a lineage that will continue, and these things need to be iterated over and over and over again until maybe we could build a building like this out of paper, but it would only be designed to last for 6 months, like I said.
Thank you.
Thanks.